right? So we read in that last sentence, we read it twice because it's so good, how the executive head, their duty is if someone's not following God's laws, that they have to be punished. Now, these days, we have man's laws and we have God's laws. We know that God's laws are inferior, are superior. Man's laws are inferior. But it doesn't always look like that. Usually the state executive heads are more concerned with man's laws than God's laws, unfortunately, these days. And so we see that there's some confusion going about as to what is actually right and what is actually wrong, because we can become influenced by those who are in charge of making sure there's a balance. So today we're going to talk about the importance of God's laws, how to identify them, how to follow them, etc. So the first, I want to read a little section from a book. It was compiled. It's called Teachings of Queen Kunti. It's based on the chapter of Bhagavatam, which was called the Prayers of Queen Kunti. And the book there are 26 verses where Queen Kunti is offering her prayers. And so this book is the verses from Srimad Bhagavatam, Srila Prabhupada's commentary in his purport, but then it's also a transcription of some lectures, a lecture series that Srila Prabhupada gave on these verses in Los Angeles. I think it was 1973. So this book it has the verse from Bhagavatam, the purport from Bhagavatam, and then also an excerpt of lectures that were specifically on these verses. So on the 13th of these 26 verses, this is Srila Prabhupada's lecture. So this is in this book. Of course, human life does not actually begin until there is some conception of religion, dharma. But in the present age, Kali Yuga, dharma is practically nil. There is no religion or morality, and there are no pious activities. And therefore, according to Vedic calculations, the present human civilization does not even consist of human beings. Formerly, people would care about morality and immorality, religion and irreligion. But with the progress of Kali Yuga, this is all being vanquished, and people can do anything without caring what it is. Srimad Bhagavatam says, and we can actually see, that in Kali Yuga, about 80% of the people are sinful. Illicit sex life, intoxication, meat eating, and gambling are the 4 pillars of sinful life. And therefore, we request that one first break these 4 pillars so that the roof of sinful life will collapse. Then, by chanting Hare Krishna, one can remain established in a transcendental position. It is a very simple method. Thank you, that Mother Shobharade. So, I chose to read this excerpt because we've been talking about the 4 legs of Dharma, the 4 pillars of religion, right? And how, as the yugas went by, each of these legs was diminished. And now we're in Kali Yuga, so there's only 1 leg left. And even that leg is being challenged, right? So as Srila Prabhupada mentioned in that lecture on that prayer of Queen Kunti, is about 80% of the people are actually sinful, engaging in these different activities. Now, just like Dharma has 4 pillars, sinful life also has 4 pillars, right? And so, the pillars of religion were mercy, cleanliness, austerity, and truthfulness. Thank you. I forgot that one. And the 4 pillars of sinful life, as Srila Prabhupada pointed out, are illicit sex, intoxication, meat eating, and gambling. So as long as we're engaging in these four things, then the roof of sinful life will remain, and we take shelter under that roof, which means the light that's coming from Krishna, we're in the shadow of it, we're hiding from it. And these things are helping us hide from it. And so Srila Prabhupada says that we request that one first break these four pillars so that that roof of sinful life will collapse. Then, by chanting Hare Krishna, one can remain established in the transcendental position, right? So we want to reestablish the dharma. So in some previous classes, I brought up these two quotes. I'm going to bring them up again about the root of sin and the root of spiritual advancement, because this is applicable here. Again, because there's dharma, there's religious principles, and then there's sinful life, right? And we can either cultivate one or the other. There's not actually a third option. So this first quote, this comes from the Shriyas Upanishad Mantra 1 purport. Toward the very end, Srila Prabhupada says that the root of sin is deliberate disobedience of the laws of nature through disregarding the proprietorship of the Lord. The deliberate disobedience of the laws of nature through disregarding the proprietorship of the Lord. So we see that this is actually the main theme of those four pillars of sinful life. It's all about disregarding the proprietorship of the Supreme Lord and thinking that we are proprietors, we're controllers, we're enjoyers individually, and we're not paying much attention to God. And so therefore we engage in these different activities, and that holds up this roof of sinful life. Then the second quote is from Sri Tattva Sutra. This is Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur's his analytical study of Shriyas Upanishad. Analytical is not the word I was looking for. It is an analytical study, but there's another word. Thematic study. So there's systematic, which goes through verse by verse, but then there's thematic. So he takes themes of the Shriyas Upanishad and then presents them in that order. So they don't go in the exact order of the verses. But so Sri Tattva Sutra 4, in his commentary, Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur says, inquiry after the supreme reality is the root of spiritual advancement. Right? So we have the root of sin, which is disregarding the proprietorship of the Lord. And then the root of spiritual advancement is inquiring after that supreme reality. So this principle is the common element of the four pillars of religion, right? Because if we're inquiring into the supreme reality, that means we do want to get that light. We do want to understand that absolute truth, right? And so those are the two options. We can either understand that Krishna is the center, he's the source of everything, he is the proprietor of everything, and we can act accordingly. Or we consider ourselves individual proprietors, controllers and enjoyers, and then we can live in that way, right? And so there's religious life and there's sinful life. Now, we tend to think that there's a third option, that we can sort of just figure out a way to live life in this world that's nice. It's that we see that there's all sorts of bad going on, and we want to counteract that. And so we come up with these ideas and we establish these laws of man in order to counteract all these different bad things that are happening. But we don't realize that unless we're actually getting these laws from God, we're merely going to create more disturbances in society. So there's a verse that I also quote often by Srila Rupa Goswami in Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu 1.2.101. Shruti Smriti Puranadi Pancharatra Vidim Vina Aikantaki Harer Bhaktir Utpatayaiva Kalpate. Devotional service of the Lord that ignores the authorized Vedic literatures like the Upanishads, Puranas, and Narada Pancharatra is simply an unnecessary disturbance in society. Means anytime we make any decision that's not backed by the Upanishads, the Puranas, the Narada Pancharatra, the Shastra, it means that we will be creating unnecessary disturbances in society. It's as simple as that. Again, we wish there was a third option. We think there is, but there's not. And that's what Srila Rupa Goswami is pointing out. If it's not backed by Shastra, then that means we're not taking Krishna's words. We're thinking of something on our own that this at least will counteract this bad thing, right? But unfortunately, that doesn't work out well. So following God's laws is important, because without following them, there's absolutely no way we can get out of this material world. And trying to make the world a better place, we just end up creating unnecessary disturbances in society. Either we follow God's laws and transcend the problems, or we follow anything else and create more problems, right? There's this expression, the path to hell is paved with good intentions, right? I'm sure we've all heard this maxim. So we may have good intentions. We may want to be saving the world. And we may be counteracting some pretty horrific things that are in this material world. But unless they're following the Shastra, unless they're backed by the Shastra, they're just going to create more problems. And that's why we have this progression of the Yuga cycles. It's people with good intentions trying to fix things, but not according to God's laws. And therefore, the problems become more and more intense. And the reason is that this is actually the source of all problems. The source of all problems is that we think ourselves independent from God and his laws. We think that we can get by without having to even listen to God's laws or know what they are, right? We think, no, this is, we can figure out a way to do this. We see something wrong, we correct it, but we don't really know what correct is. And that's the problem. So sometimes God's laws are confusing, right? Sometimes they're difficult to understand. If we do understand them, sometimes they're difficult to accept, right? We understand and we hear, okay, I got it, but it's still hard to accept. And then even further than that, sometimes even if we can accept them, they're very difficult to follow because we have these material attachments. So since there are all of these difficulty in understanding them to begin with, just to understand what the Shastra is saying, which we'll get more to later because it's important how to approach Shastra. And then after that, difficult to accept after we understand it, and then even more difficult to follow through with that, to act accordingly. Because of these difficulties, sometimes in trying to follow God's laws, while also adhering to whatever material moral codes we hold dear, or just specific desires or preferences that we have imbibed based on personal experiences or our limited understanding, we think that we need to make adjustments, right? Because we do appreciate that Shastra is there, it's God's laws, right? But we still have these very strong impressions due to our past activities, our experiences, our mundane logic, that there are certain things that we consider to be absolutely right and absolutely wrong, right? And they're not based on Shastra, they're based on experiences. So we try to, even though we appreciate the Shastra, they're coming down, we see these laws, but we're seeing them through our conditioned nature, through this lens of the three modes of nature that we're looking through, and we don't see it clearly, and so we don't understand it, then we don't accept it, and then we don't follow it properly, right? So we think that we have to make some adjustments because we say, Krishna, hey, I hear what you're saying, I appreciate you looking out for me, but I don't think it's practical. It's not applicable in this particular situation. It's just not possible, right? Sometimes we think this. We think times have changed, and I think it'd be better if we just make a minor adjustment to your law to make it more palatable, right? We do this. Well, even while doing this, we will cite Guru, Sadhu, and Shastra to justify why we shouldn't follow Krishna's instructions, right? So we have this idea that we're convinced is right based on our experiences and logic. And we look through Shastra to find supporting evidence for that. This is what we end up doing. So Shastra's there, but we have this attachment, and then so we start looking through Shastra to justify why we don't think that we should actually follow it in that way, right? So we look through Shastra to find supporting evidence for whatever idea we have by our conditioning. And we tend to ignore any references that don't support our idea, right? In other words, we'll be looking through and we'll see some things that they're actually going against what we're trying to establish. And so we tend to, it's probably something that maybe was translated wrong, or, that doesn't apply here. Let's, focus on that. It was a different situation, a different time, like that. We do that. And we look for the ones that will actually support what we're basically trying to establish, right? The problem with that is that we forget that there are actually no contradictions in Shastra. There is a proper way to approach Shastra, and that's not it. It's not by trying to, having an idea, being sold on it in our heads, and then trying to find something in Shastra that will support that. That's not how it works, because there are no contradictions in Shastra. Sometimes there are points in Shastra that seem to be contradictory. Like it'll say you do this, and it'll say also you have to do this. And we'll think, well, you can't do both of those things. And so sometimes it just means that there is, between a time, place, and circumstance, you do this or you do this. But oftentimes it's the same. That you have to do both, and you have to understand how both simultaneously can occur, right? They're not contradictory. They're just, we don't understand them yet. And so in order to do that, we have to approach Shastra with the proper mood. So we know from 4th chapter of Gita how to approach a spiritual master, for example, and why we should approach a spiritual master. They have seen the truth. They have something that we're looking for, right? So that's the why. And then the how is that we approach them in a humble and submissive mood, and then we render service unto them. We have to give them something to show them that we actually appreciate what they're giving us. It's something that we don't have, that we value, and we want it. And so we approach it in that mood, knowing that you have all of the right answers that I'm looking for. Pardon me. And so in a humble and submissive way, we accept everything that the spiritual master says, and then we reciprocate by following those instructions. So with Shastra, it's the same way. It's not that we should have this idea that we're trying to prove by Shastra. It's that we should approach Shastra in a way to just figure out how we're supposed to act, how we're supposed to think, how we're supposed to understand, what we're supposed to accept, and how we're supposed to follow that. All right, this should be the mood. If we have any personal motive and we want to justify misbehavior while looking through Shastra, we will find exactly what we're looking for. But it won't be Krishna, because that's not what we're looking for. In other words, if we're looking to justify our activities, we'll find a justification of that activity. We won't find Krishna, though, even though we're looking through Shastra, right? So there's an example that I'm going to give. It's an extreme example. Let's say someone, for example, they're new to the Hare Krishna scene. They've heard that, we don't eat meat, fish, or eggs, and all of this. But let's say this person's very attached to eating meat. So let's say he says, okay, well, I want to still eat meat. I'm going to find something in Shastra that says I can eat meat. And they don't even have to look that far. You don't even have to go to the lower Shastras where they have these different animal sacrifices and you have to perform these ceremonies. They don't even have to go that far. They can go into Veda base, Srila Prabhupada's quotes, and they can find this conversation with Harikesh Maharaj. Harikesh Maharaj was sent to the Eastern Europe to preach, and he was finding it difficult to preach there. And so he was giving all of these different arguments to Srila Prabhupada why he can't preach in the Eastern Europe. And he's saying, there's not enough money, there's not enough funding, there's nothing to eat there. All they have is meat. And then Srila Prabhupada said, then eat meat. If that's all that's there, you preach, you eat meat, right? So someone might see that and they say, okay, well, Srila Prabhupada said, then eat meat. In some circumstances, it's okay to eat meat. Srila Prabhupada said, therefore, I have my justification, and now I'm just going to continue on eating meat, right? So if that's what we're looking for, we will find it. But of course, those of us that know this story know that Srila Prabhupada he knew Harikesh Maharaj wasn't actually going to eat meat, and he knew that there was other food there. He was just using it as an excuse. Srila Prabhupada wanted to point out that the preaching is the most important thing, right? And so that's why this, transaction happened between Srila Prabhupada and Harikesh Swami. So if we can see it in that way, we can understand, then there certainly are no contradictions. One might say, well, that's a contradiction because it says we're not supposed to eat meat, but then Srila Prabhupada said then eat meat, right? So this is an extreme example, but most of us actually have done this at some point, right? Not to that extreme, but to some extent, we know what we're meant to do based on Shastra, but we have a material attachment. We don't have a tendency to follow that. And so, but we also don't want to not follow Shastra. So we try to find somewhere else in Shastra, or a statement from the Guru, or something from the sadhus, and we try to justify what we're doing so that we can go against Shastra. Who has ever done that in their life? There's a raise hand button on, or you can turn your video on and raise your hand. Maybe I'm the only one that's ever done that. Okay, I'm the only one that's ever done that. So I apologize to everyone that I've done that. But this is actually a fairly common thing. Where
we always do it.
Bob's hands up, and who just said we always do it? Krishna Kirtan Prabhu? Yeah. We do, right? We do always do it. It's not even something that, long ago when I was, Bhakta so-and-so, I've done it. We always do this, right? We know what's right, but then we look at other areas of Shastra or examples to make us feel better about not following Krishna's, instructions. Now, we shouldn't feel too bad about that. Like, we should feel bad enough that we should try to stop doing it. But we should understand that we're not alone. Arjuna also did that. Of course, he did it for our benefit. But Krishna told Arjuna what to do, right? He said, okay, here you are. We're here on the battle of Kurukshetra. You have to engage in this battle because it's basically going to establish dharma. And so it has to be done. So you fight. And so Arjuna was ready to fight. Everybody's blowing their conch shells. They're amped. They're excited. And then Arjuna said, okay, let me see. Please draw my chariot between the two armies. I want to see who's assembled here ready to fight. And then Krishna shows him Bhishma Dev and Dronacharya. And Arjuna gets bewildered. And he has doubts. So Krishna told him what to do, but he had doubts, right? He's like, no, I don't know. He had doubts, and he also had a lot of suggestions. Maybe I'll do this instead. Maybe I'll run away to the forest. Maybe I'll, do this. And he also quoted saintly persons who were in disciplic succession. He said, well, I've heard through disciplic succession that those who destroy family tradition always dwell in hell. And I can't, if I engage in warfare with these people who are worthy of my worship, that's going to destroy family tradition. So he's using Shastra to go against Krishna's words. And then he says, Krishna, Govinda, I shall not fight, right? So this is what we do. We do the same thing. We know what we're meant to do from Shastra. If we're actually reading Shastra, we know what we're meant to do, but we have these attachments. So in Arjuna's case, it was familial attachment. His teacher and his respectable grandfather were there, and he certainly didn't want to kill them. And so he's quoting Shastra, he's quoting saintly persons who are in disciplic succession to show how actually that's not the proper way to act. And even though they were aggressors, because there are 6 kinds of aggressors that it's okay to kill. Even though they were aggressors, there's also the idea that they are great personalities. So sometimes there's exceptions. And so you don't kill those, even though there's no sin for killing those aggressors, you still don't do it, because then other things happen, the family tradition is destroyed, etc. And so he's giving these various arguments, right? So again, Arjuna is doing those for our benefit, but that's there. So then Krishna says, so I'm going to read another section. So Bhagavad Gita 2:11. Thank you. Very quick of you. I'll just read the translation and the purport here. So this is just after Arjuna then said, I'm a soul surrendered unto you. Tell me what to do. So the Supreme Personality of Godhead said, while speaking learned words, you are mourning for what is not worthy of grief. Those who are wise lament neither for the living nor for the dead. Purport. The Lord at once took the position of a teacher and chastised the student, calling him indirectly a fool. The Lord says, you are talking like a learned man, but you do not know that one who is learned, one who knows what is body and what is soul, does not lament for any stage of the body, neither in the living nor in the dead condition. As explained in later chapters, it will be clear that knowledge means to know matter and spirit and the controller of both. Now this comes up a lot in Bhagavad Gita, Srila Prabhupada, when he defines knowledge. It's about knowing matter, spirit, the controller of both, and then eventually he'll also talk about the relation between those. Arjuna argued that religious principles should be given more importance than politics or sociology. But he did not know that knowledge of matter, soul, and the supreme is even more important than religious formularities. And because he was lacking in that knowledge, he should not have posed himself as a very learned man. As he did not happen to be a very learned man, he was consequently lamenting for something which was unworthy of lamentation. The body is born and is destined to be vanquished today or tomorrow. Therefore, the body is not as important as the soul. One who knows this is actually learned, and for him there is no cause for lamentation, regardless of the condition of the material body. Thank you for popping that up, Mother Shobharadhe. So, knowledge means to know matter, spirit, and the controller of both. Controller means Krishna, obviously, and controller means that's the relationship. So Krishna is his relationship with matter and spirit is that he's the controller of both, which means that we, minute spirit souls, we are not the controller, right? Because Krishna is the controller. So we see that's what the relationship is. So there are many Sanskrit words for knowledge, right? There's Gyan, there's Vidya, there's so many. There's Vigyan, which is realized knowledge. But there's a term that is specifically pointing out this type of knowledge. Does anyone know what that is? Does anyone want to chime in there? The word Gyan's also in there, but there's a word before it that talks about the differences in the relationships between spirit, matter, and the supreme controller. It's okay. It's sambandha gyan. So it's knowledge of the relationship, right? So this is a very important thing to understand the relationships of things. So just for an example, I'll pick something that everybody does. Everybody eats, right? Everybody has to eat, otherwise you don't live. So there's knowledge, right? Just in general knowledge of, what food is and what the concept of eating is, replenishing the energy that we expend, etc. And so we have to know what food is, what different types of food are, what what the mouth is, what the stomach is. We have to know what all these things are. That's knowledge. But we also have to know the relationship of these things, right? So we not only have to be able to identify what is actually food and where is our mouth, but we also have to know what is the relationship. So the hand can pick up the food since we already know what it is and deliver it to the mouth, and then the mouth delivers it to the stomach. The stomach, breaks everything down and then distributes it throughout the body for energy. If we don't understand the relationships of the things, if we just understand what things are, but we don't understand what the relationship is, then we don't benefit from it, right? So in the example of food, we may know what food is and what it does. It nourishes the body. But if we're just smushing it around in our hand or rubbing it on our head or like that, we're not going to get the nourishment. We might think, well, why not? It's so much more practical because, because then I can just wash it off and then everything's okay. Then I won't have to, do anything, it's just ridiculous. We can come up with all these different things. No, but I know this has the nourishment, right? Yeah, that has the nourishment. It's right food. It's not like, a baby, for example, they pick up everything and they put it in their mouth because they don't know that that's actually not food. They're trying to discover what these things are by putting things in their mouth, but they'll put anything in their mouth, right? So one step up of that is knowing the difference between, what one should put in their mouth and what one shouldn't. But then one has to also understand the relationship. Then, okay, so it is food, but then it actually has to go in the mouth so it can go to the stomach so it can distribute nourishment throughout the body. So the relationship is very important, is a very important aspect of knowledge. It's not enough just to know what things are and what they do. One needs to know the relationship of those things and how to act accordingly, right? So again, as Srila Prabhupada pointed out in his purport, knowledge means to know matter, spirit, the controller, both, and of course, the relationship between these three. That's knowledge. In other words, proper credence. Anything else is miscredence, as Brihat Mridanga Prabhu pointed out in yesterday's class. Miscreants are those who follow the wrong credence, right? So we have to not only know, but also act according to the correct credence. Who knows the Sanskrit word for that? So we had sambandha, which was the knowledge of the relationship. What does it mean when you have that knowledge and then you act accordingly? Does anyone know the word for that?
Prayojana?
That's the goal. Prayojana would be the goal.
Abhideya.
Abhideya, good. So when we act accordingly, it's the abhideya. And then as we act accordingly, then we get the prayojana. So you're not far off there. So once we learn how to act accordingly, then that's how we attain the prayojana. So again, I already did that. So oftentimes we're here in the material world, right? We know what it's like in the spiritual world. We know that everything's perfect. We know that there's no quarrel. There's nothing like that. But we tend to, being here in the material world, we tend to try to create a situation that's like the spiritual world, but we still act materially. So we can't expect the material world to be like the spiritual world because it's a matter of consciousness. As long as we're identifying with the false ego instead of the real ego, we'll always face problems. There's always going to be degradation, exploitation, quarrel, hypocrisy, suffering. And the solution isn't trying to manipulate the material energy to make it more favorable to our comfort. It's to transcend the material energy by making ourselves more favorable for loving Krishna, right? So it's not that we want to change our situation to make it better. We want to actually transcend this situation so that we can return to lovingly serving Krishna. And the way we do this, Shruti Shriti Puranadi Pancharatra Vidimbina, we follow God's laws, right? If we follow God's laws, then we go back. If we don't follow God's laws, even if we have the best intentions, we're trying to make the world a better place, we will be creating unnecessary disturbances in society. If we fail to make the proper spiritual connection, right, to act according to the sambandha, to actually do the abhideya, if we fail to do that, we will still be dealing with material nature. Simple as that. There's the root of sin, there's the root of spiritual advancement. If we're thinking ourselves independent controllers and enjoyers, if we're acting not based on Shastra, anything that's not based on Shastra, if we're acting in that, we're using our whim, we're using our personal experiences, we're using logic and reasoning, trying to, well, this is wrong, so if we do this, that'll counteract that. If that is not based on Shastra, then it's just going to create unnecessary disturbances in society. Just because we're dealing with material nature in a nicer way doesn't mean we will get good results, right? The results, it might yield some temporary benefits, right? So some of the bad things that we're trying to counteract for some period of time, they might be subsided, but there will be more problems later if we're not actually following Shastra. So the sole cause of our suffering is our apparent separation from Krishna, right? The illusion of being separate from Krishna, because nothing is separate from Krishna. But since we've imposed this illusion upon ourselves to being separate from Krishna, and we're acting like that, that is the cause of all of our suffering. So in order to relieve this suffering, we have to get rid of that consciousness, that idea that we're separate. And so we stop making decisions based on what we think is right, and we start making the decisions based on what Shastra says is right. That is actual credence. Otherwise, we are a miscreant. Again, we follow Shruti, Smriti, Purana, Adi, Pancharatra, Vidya, right? So Krishna, as Brihadmridanga Prabhu also pointed out, he annihilates the miscreants. And our duty as his devotees is to annihilate our miscredence, annihilate our tendency to act not according to proper credence, not according to proper sambandha, not understanding what that relationship is and acting accordingly. We have to stop acting according to misinformation, any of man's laws that we are attached to, any moral codes that we've just accepted, not because they're in Shastra, just because we think, okay, yeah, that makes sense, right? Yeah, let's follow that. We have to stop doing these things. We have to take Shastra seriously so that we can properly engage in Krishna service without causing unnecessary disturbances in society. So just as Maharaj Parikshit was ready to uproot this upstart, even if he were a denizen of heaven, regardless of his position, wealth, resources, etc., we should also be prepared to uproot the misinformation in our heads, regardless of how much comfort, stability, pleasure, shelter, whatever they provide for us, right? So we have experience of this these days. If one has enough money, power, or influence, the laws don't actually apply to him, right? But today's verse shows us that Maharaj Parikshit doesn't care how much power, influence, money, resources you have, even if you are considered amara or deathless. You will be punished if you disobey the laws of nature, right? So this is also saying that it doesn't matter these ideas that we have of man-made laws, moral codes. It doesn't matter how comfortable they make us or how they serve us in providing us with safety or security or anything like that. It doesn't matter how positive they seem to be. If they're not following God's laws, then they have to be uprooted, right? These upstarts have to be uprooted. This is what today's verse means for us, right? So from yesterday's purport, as Brihadmridanga Prabhu also pointed out several times, he read this sentence a couple times. It was such a great sentence. It is the prime duty of the king or executive head to give protection in all respects to the peaceful, offenseless citizens of the state, right? And why is that the prime duty? Because if that is followed, if they take that as their prime duty, then the citizens can easily practice Krishna consciousness, and thus all the praja will be truly protected, right? The king and executive head, their nature is to protect others. And so the best way to protect everyone is to give them an environment that's suitable for spiritual development, right? For spiritual growth. But for those of us who are not kings or executive heads, most of us, then we are to create this same peaceful atmosphere or environment in our minds by weeding out all of the misinformation or these miscredences, no matter how much we're attached to them, right? We could think, okay, well, this thing happened to me when I was young, and ever since then I knew that this was right and this was wrong. But if it's not, in other words, if we have that experience and then it's also supported in Shastra, then that's okay. We continue to follow that. But if it's something that's not supported in Shastra, then we have to give that up because that is miscredence. So I'm going to read the last sentence of today's purport again. It should be the principle of the state executive head that the offender of the codes of God is always punished. So for us, that means I'll just reword that a little bit. The principle of every devotee is that any idea that goes against the codes of God should be abandoned. And then one last time before we stop, I will read the verse from Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, Shruti Smriti Purana di Pancharatra Vidhimvina Aikantaki Harer Bhaktir Utpata Yaiva Kalpate. Devotional service of the Lord that ignores the authorized Vedic literatures like the Upanishads, Puranas, and Narada Pancharatra is simply an unnecessary disturbance in society. So we have to approach Shastra in the proper mood, as we mentioned, humble, submissive, in this mood that we're trying to find out the truth and we're going to adjust accordingly, not I have an idea and I want to justify it by Shastra. And then act according to those instructions. So have the proper mood, receive it, and then act according to those instructions. Obviously, there may be questions. Arjuna also had doubts, and so he questioned his spiritual master. He questioned Krishna. So if we have doubts when we're studying Shastra, we ask our guru, we follow the examples of the sadhus, and we come to understand what is the absolute definitive truth, and then we act accordingly. Otherwise, no matter what our intentions are, no matter how good our intentions are, we will be creating unnecessary disturbances in society. So I will stop there and see if there are any questions, comments, reflections, corrections.
Thank you very much, Prabhu. That was unbelievable as usual. I do have something that I want to ask, but before that, I'd like to offer it up to the rest of the audience. If you have any questions, please just, unmute yourself or raise your hand. Lots and lots of practical advice, and that is what I really like, how to apply all of these teachings to our lives every day. One thing that you had said and was the progression of the yugas was because of making adjustments, trying to justify. But I don't know how that has happened. Like what is an example of that?
So the way that it's said is that, so there are the four pillars of religion, and gradually in each yuga, one is diminished. And so as one is diminished, that means the reason it's diminished is because instead of focusing on Krishna, we're focusing on ourselves in that particular area. So there are four areas, but it's the same uplying principle. And so we become more and more independent. Like, so in other words, in the material world, we're here because we think we're independent from Krishna, right? Mm-hmm. But at least in Satya Yuga, we think we're independent, but we're still at least following his laws, right? Mm-hmm. But little by little, in each of these realms, we start paying or giving more credence to our own desires than Krishna's, and we start acting further and further away. So as the yugas progress, Kali Yuga, basically, like Srila Prabhupada pointed out, like 80% of the population is sinful, probably more by now. And as he also points out, that means we're actually subhuman. Anybody that's simple, they're not, according to the Vedas, they're not even acting on the human platform, right? And so, and this is because we think that we're independent. We think that we're superior to Krishna. We think that our rules that we've come up with are actually superior to his, right? We think, no, Krishna, that, sure, what you said in the Shastra, I'm sure it was true at some time, but nowadays the situation is different, and people just can't accept it, so we're going to do it a different way. So that means we think that we're more intelligent than Krishna, right? And as long as we think that, that's actually the reason why we're here, because we think that we can do anything better than Krishna, right? And so here we are in the material world. Now, the way to get out of that is to get rid of that mentality, right? So the root of all sin is to disregard Krishna's position And the root of spiritual advancement is inquiring into the supreme reality. So to approach Shastra and to understand, okay, this is how I'm meant to work. So we purify first our intelligence by reading Shastra. So then instead of when we make our decisions, the mind accepts and rejects, the intelligence analyzes. So the material intelligence analyzes based on past experiences, etc. Spiritual intelligence analyzes only based on Shastra. Right. And so when we get to that point where our intelligence, instead of kicking around ideas, whether they're right or wrong based on mundane moral codes, when they're actually based on Shastra, then we start making better decisions, right? And it's all about the consciousness. It's whether I'm the center or Krishna is the center. And so we see as the yugas progress, it becomes more and more about us. We're trying to enjoy independently, and everything becomes quite messy.
Thank you.
Sure. And we'll see at the end of Kali Yuga, if you read the 12th canto, it gets very, very, very messy.
Hopefully we'll get our act together and get out of here before that time. Go ahead, Krishna Kirtan Prabhu.
Yeah, if I have your order, thank you.
Yes.
I could have had many conversations this morning, but actually I'm stuck with some catering service. But anyway, but I think you brought some nice points. It's amazing that how we as a devotees we get carried away by different opinions, and we try to justify our own. Such an unfortunate thing, and world and feels like divided. On the other hand, maybe we just have to learn, just accept. Maybe that's just like different munis has different opinions. Maybe we just have to consolidate. But I'm seeing that day by day, there's always different opinions based on the Shastras. Shastra says that, okay, how in general it happens that, the human is given as a charity, the daughter is given as charity. The father gives the daughter as a charity, but nowadays people don't want to hear the charity, daughter is a charity. Does it make sense? So
Yeah.
say, why?
Yes.
You cannot present this, or you cannot present this, arranged marriage without knowing, timeless. Yes, I understand, but at the same time, we cannot condemn the Shastras also. It has needed. We have to approach the Shastra in a proper attitude and proper mode. How will we handle those lack of knowledge? Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for that question. Good example too. So I'll just go right with your example, because the thing is, first off, like you said, just with munis, there can be devotees that are just focusing on different areas that, it's in their wheelhouse and they're comfortable with, and that's okay. What's not okay is if those are just based on their material conditioning, and therefore that's what they're focusing on. It's okay if they're expert in the area, and that's why they're focusing on that, and they're doing it with the consciousness that this is for Krishna. It's not okay if they could be doing the exact same activity. It could look very similar from the outside, but if they're doing it because of their material conditioning, and they're just consulting parts of Shastra instead of the rest of it, because these others, the way you said with the munis having different ideas, the devotees that are focused on different areas, they also accept the rest, but they're just more expert in their current areas. So they're not denying that the others are wrong, or that they're not denying that the others are right. It's just not their field. So in that sense, if that's the case, it's okay. If someone's saying, no, this is the only way, and if anybody thinks anything different, then they're nonsense, because I base mine on Shastra. But even though the others are also basing theirs on Shastra. But the things that you brought up, they're interesting because, you know, giving the girl away in charity. So that sounds, these days, that sounds bad, right? But even in the Western concept, you know, the father gives away the bride. You know, the father walks the bride down the aisle and he gives her. That actually, this means the same exact thing, giving her away. It doesn't mean it's, you know, that the bride doesn't want to go and it's just like, oh yeah, here's some charity, and you know, she had nothing to do with it. But and then you brought up also arranged marriage. So the funny thing about that is if a marriage is arranged properly means according to the natures of the bride and the groom. If it's done properly, then the marriage will actually last. Unfortunately, some people were arranging marriages based on a business transaction. You know, there was one family, they wanted to merge with they have a company and they wanted to merge with another company. So it's just better for their business if their kids get married, and they didn't actually see if their natures were compatible. That kind of arranged marriage is absolutely not good, right? And so it gave arranged marriages a bad name. But if one actually looks into the nature of people, how they're going to get along, then we don't fall into these traps where we see in modern days where the divorce rate, I think it used to be 50, I think it's like 75% now. We see that people who just get married just based on attraction, that initial attraction, what happens is they're attracted to one another. And so they're not actually themselves at first. They're trying to be the best version of themselves. They're trying to adjust themselves so that, you know, they can attract that mate. And both are doing that. They're compromising so that, you know, but then after some time, their true nature comes out and they don't want to compromise. And then all of a sudden they don't get along very much, and, you know, and they give up. And they also don't have this sense, which comes from Dharma, this sense of duty, this sense of, you know, because marriage is meant to be till death do us part, and eternal, it's meant to be a bond that lasts throughout the entire life, right? It's not meant to be like a, you know, like a trial run or a temporary promise. It's meant to be, you know, you're meant to be united under God, and, you know, that's how it's meant to be. So yeah, we have these different ideas based on that. And so yeah, so arranged marriage is actually not an issue. It's that it was misused. And so since it was misused, it's easy to convince others that it shouldn't be done, because most people will bring up, oh yeah, you know, what about this 12-year-old girl that was given to this 70-year-old man, and it's, you know, it's just so they can have it. No, of course, that's not okay. That's not good, right? But if it's done properly, then marriages will last. If it's shown that the natures actually match, and the people are have this sense of understanding that relationship is meant to last, and that's their, then everything works out. So it depends on how we approach these things. If we approach them materially, then it won't work. Like I said, with, you know, if it's a business arrangement, then it's not going to work. But if we approach them according to Shastra, then everything will work, has the potential to work. So yeah, these things, they're there, they've been misused, but that doesn't mean they're useless. We have to learn how to use them properly. And then when we do use them properly, then they work quite well. Did that answer that, Krishna Kirtan Prabhu?
Yeah, thank you. At the end of the day, we cannot just directly jump into conclusions, because I think this is the way it is. It needs a very lot of maturity to accept every aspects and come to a conclusion. Otherwise, we'll find just fault and will be discouraged. That's what I was thinking. Even though it is in the Shastras, but still, it needs a lot of maturity.
Absolutely.
To embrace this and understand the right perspective. And unfortunately, many times we just carried away with our own opinions. That's why so much of disturbances and disagreements and all
Yes.
this. Yeah. Thank you.
Yes, because again, it can be difficult to understand, then difficult to accept, and then difficult to follow, right? So there's all these difficulties, but the only way to relieve these difficulties is first to approach Shastra in the proper mood, and then also have these discussions based on Shastra. So, for example, so if we're talking about arranged marriages, we can talk about that, and then you could talk about the difficulties of it, but the difficulties of it should also be spoken about according to Shastra. In other words, it should always be according to Shastra. It shouldn't be, well, in this situation, it was like that, and therefore it was bad. And so, okay, yeah, that's true. There was a bad situation, but shastrically, why was it bad? Because they weren't going by nature, they were going by something else, right? Just like people say varnashram, we shouldn't have to follow, because it's, they had that caste system and it was corrupt, and we don't want that to happen again. That's a valid point. But what's happening now is we have in the position of kshatriyas, we have either vaishyas or shudras. So instead of protecting the citizens, they're just trying to profit off of them. So it's not a good system. In other words, they still have all of the positions, they just don't have the right people in those positions, right? So it's not that people are rejecting this hierarchy. There still is a hierarchy. It's just the wrong people are at the top. And therefore, everyone's having a problem, even the people at the top, because they're not being properly guided. They're not getting spiritual benefit, right? And so nobody's actually happy, right? But if we actually followed the Shastra, the hierarchy is still there. And it's not a hierarchy in the sense that I'm better than you. It's just that, no, by my nature, I can do this particular type of work. And by my nature, I can do this particular type of work. And we work together and everybody benefits. And we all have the potential to go back to Godhead, whether we're Brahmana, Kshatriya, Vaishya, Shudra, Brahmacharya, Vanaprastha, Grihastha, Sannyas. It doesn't matter. We engage properly, then we can go back to Godhead. So when we take it away from Shastra, we take a Shastra concept and we take it away from Shastra and discuss it in a material way, the way that it was materially followed. Of course, we can figure out why we shouldn't do it, because it wasn't done right. Everybody can agree that we shouldn't do the corrupt. Well, not everybody. Some of the caste brahmanas will say that we should do that system, but that's because they don't. It's not because they want to follow Shastra. It's because they want to have prestige, and that's the problem. That's why Shastra says that it's by quality, not by birth, right? So, but if we have to understand Shastra well enough to actually know that. Otherwise, we're just going to try to imitate the system. Like in math, right? So we start learning math, and then all of a sudden in second grade, we all picked up a calculus book and just started doing calculus, right? No, nobody started doing that in second grade. We had to, it's still math, but you have to go through these different levels to understand deeper. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to perform calculus with a second grade education in math. And therefore we're saying it can't work, right? No, it absolutely does work. We just don't know how to do it yet. So we have to train ourselves further according to Shastra, not according to man-made laws, not according to personal experience or logic, but according to the Shastra. How can we understand it properly so that we can do it the right way, right? There's plenty of wrong ways to do it. And the common theme of all of those wrong ways is disregarding that. Let me see. Get back to that quote. The root of sin, deliberate disobedience of the laws of nature through disregarding the proprietorship of the Lord, right? That's always going to be the wrong way, whether referring to Shastra or mundane logic. And the right way will always be inquiry into the supreme reality. That's the root of spiritual advancement. So whatever we're dealing with, if our intention is to disregard the proprietorship of the Lord, it's going to be a disturbance in society. If our intention is to understand the Lord through studying his words and following the Guru and the sadhus, then we'll have a proper result. So we have to learn to do this. We have to learn to bring our education level of Shastra up to the point where we can properly apply these things and properly discuss these things. Even if we're not applying them yet, we should at least have enough understanding of Shastra that we can have conversations with other people who also know the Shastra. And so, okay, well, what about this point? What about this point? All based on Shastra, and then we can properly understand it, accept it, and apply it, right? So it takes some time. It takes some, but it's worth it, But we can either act according to Krishna or we can act according to our whims. Acting according to our whims will create unnecessary disturbances in society. There's no other option. And acting according to Krishna properly will cause us to transcend this material nature. So it will take some time and some.
Yeah, thank you. It'll take some time. We have to stick to the society with patience without running away, because people have different opinions.
Patience, dedication, sincerity, all of these things, very important.
Yeah. And unfortunately, I'm sorry I'm taking long also. Unfortunately, we don't follow the Sadhu Shastra. We just stick to my opinion because I like it. I understand this. And we come to a conclusion. I've seen people are not ready to accept what spiritual master also says anyway. That's a big thing. But I think we need to handle these things very maturely. Okay, let people have different opinions. Let cross over. Continue. We don't get stuck into one discussions and different opinions very much. Thank you so much for sharing. Hare Krishna.
Thank you. Hare Krishna. Oh, I know too.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Prabhu. Like he said, we could continue on with this topic. But I think we got to the main theme of this class and the main point of this class. We need to keep Krishna at the center, and only then, and then follow Shastra for the right reasons and not to justify our positions. That arranged marriage topic is close to my heart at the moment because I have 3 kids who are giving me trouble with this topic. So, but I think the thing is, you were saying if marriages are done based on their natures, that is good. But also, I think the point of marriage is not sense gratification or personal satisfaction. It is the higher purpose to get us to understand Jivera Swarup Hoy Krishnera Das. And that is, and that point is not even being thought of as they're going through the process. So how is it going to work? It is meant to be unsuccessful if that's not at the center. It's just amazing. Every ritual in the marriage is towards that end, and that is not at all understood. But not to be pessimistic, not to be down, but to understand that there is a way to do this right. And we have been given that way. So let us see if we are able to progress and try our best to progress.
Yeah. That's why the samskars are so important throughout one's life. Mm-hmm. Because if those are done, those impressions are there, then by the time you get to marriage, which is another samskar, you're already understanding that the goal of life is to serve Krishna. Mm. But if you're already convinced because you don't have those previous spiritual samskars, that you have impressions from material life, you think that no, the goal of marriage is to enjoy materially, then of course you're not going to want to refer to Shastra, you're not going to want the arrangement, you're going to want, you're going to want to make your own mistakes. And so that's there. So it's important that every aspect of our life to focus on what's important, being a servant of Krishna. And if we do that consistently, then we'll easily follow along with all of these different. See, the problem is, and I'm glad you brought this up, is that the problem is many of us, we only turn to the Shastra in very small portions of our life. Mm-hmm. And since the rest of our life doesn't match that, when we do follow the Shastra and it doesn't jive with the rest of our life, we think that Shastra is wrong, right? Because we were looking for something else. We were looking for material enjoyment through Shastra. And when we didn't get it, we said, okay, no, Shastra can't be right. But it's just because we weren't jiving with that, So that, in one sense, that would be Falgul Vairagya. If we're living our entire life materialistically, and then we say, all right, well, at least when it comes to this marriage thing, I'm going to try to do it like this. And then we're dishonest with ourselves, because a lot of times when devotees go to get married, they have a whole lot of material desires, but they don't want to admit that because they're ashamed of it, right? Because devotees aren't supposed to have these material desires. So they present themselves like they don't. But then when they get married, all of a sudden it comes out that they actually do. And then if that doesn't match the other person, if it matches, it's okay. If they both have the same amount of material desires, it'll work out, and gradually they'll be able to purify themselves through, and then each of them will gradually, lose those material desires and then be more focused on spirituality. But if one's more focused on spirituality and the other one's more focused on material sense gratification, it's not going to work out. So that's why it's important to, from the very beginning, to always put that forward and to understand where we are. And then if we do that, then we can establish the proper relationships, not even with spouses, but with friends, choosing which sanghas we spend the most time with. All of this is very important. And so if we know this from Shastra, if we get proper training, then we'll be on the right path. If not, then it'll be very confusing, because we do try to do both of these things. I said there's only two options. You either follow Krishna's words or you follow your own. And so if you follow Krishna's words, you transcend the material world. If you don't, you're making the world worse. Even if you think you're doing something to counteract some of the bad stuff, you're creating unnecessary disturbances in society. There's no third option, but we think there is. We think, well, yes, we're in the material world, but what I'm going to do is actually going to make it better, right? I'm going to do these things because I see that there's a lot wrong with the material world. I'm going to counteract some of those things. So I'm actually doing the world a favor. This is what we think. And we feel good about it because maybe I'm not going back to Godhead, but at least I'm making this world a better place. And somehow we feel good about that. But according to Srila Rupa Goswami and many other acharyas and Krishna himself, that's not how it works, right? In the material world, as long as we're not acting according to Shastra, we will be creating more disturbances, even if for a brief period of time we're, making it a little more nice for, a few people, right? But it's just going to be a disturbance. So until we change that consciousness, that's what we need to change. Until we do that, we're just continuing that cycle of birth and death, and it's suffering.
Thank you very much, Prabhu. I think we've gone way done today. See everybody tomorrow morning at 7:50 for Chaitanya Charitamrita.
Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Srila Bhagavatam ki jai.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Prabhu, for a nice class.
Thank you for the nice class, Prabhu. Hare Krishna.